This video is brought to you with the support of TrueFire. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World. We're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. At the end of my video, how many guitars do you need? I glibly threw out, so how many guitars do you need? 5,000 comments later, a lot of folks said a Tele, a Strat, a Les Paul, and a 335 for everything else. How exactly did the 335 get on the list? Well, we're going to find out, because this is the 5-Watt World short history of the Gibson 335 family of instruments. If you like this style of video, be sure to subscribe. And to support what we do, grab a t-shirt, hoodie, or a 5-Watt World Barber Collaboration overdrive pedal. And become a bigger part of 5-Watt World, sign up for the Friends of 5-Watt on Patreon. There's a friend level to suit any budget. And if you're a musician who's always wanted to have your own YouTube channel but didn't know where to start, buy my YouTube Mastery for Musicians course. It's all the things I wish I knew when I started. All the links are in the description. By 1957, sales of Gibson's new solid body guitars had begun to slip. But there had been a slight uptick in the sales of the thin line guitars like the Birdland. Always close to the market, Gibson concluded that while folks might be drawn to a thinner guitar with less chance of feedback at volume, they still wanted more traditional looking guitars. Looking modern and innovative in the marketplace carried a lot of weight at the time. So Gibson decided to act, introducing the Explorer and the Flying V models. With these two shapes, Gibson might have overshot the market by about 25 years. But to satisfy the demand for more traditional shapes, they created a new double cutaway guitar, the ES-335. In 1958, Gibson had decided to go nearly all in with double cutaways with the slab body Les Paul models, the Junior, TV, and Special. It was in the climate of double cuts that the 335 was born. The story goes that then president of Gibson, Ted McCarty, suggested the semi-solid guitars. Of course, Les Paul's own log guitar had implied this long ago, but that's another story. See the short history of Les Paul for more on those details. Gibson revealed the 335 to dealers in the company's magazine, the Gibson Gazette, in February of 1958. The headline announced a new ES-335T Spanish guitar, along with a black and white photo of the guitar. We say semi-hollow today, but Gibson's literature at the time referred to them as semi-solid, and the semi-solid guitar was a completely new design. The guitar appeared in the March catalog, with the very first 335 rolling off the production line on April 21, 1958. The sunburst finish listed for $267.50, and the natural or blonde finish was $282.50. A brown lift and case was offered for an additional $46.50. To put this into perspective, in the same year, a Les Paul Jr. listed for $120, and the Super 400 listed for a cool $700. The first 335 was 16 inches at the widest point of the lower bout, built with a laminated top and back and sides and a solid internal center block of maple. The laminate was 3-ply, 2 outer plies of maple with grain running the same direction, with a layer of poplar running between them with the grain running at 90 degrees to the other plies. The center block was about 4 inches wide and was the same thickness as the rims. There was a small mahogany head block at the neck and another at the strap and button. The block was cut with a mortise for the neck tenon, and there were 2 rounded cavities for the pickups. The top and back had spruce cut to fit the arch, and the guitar had 2 rounded cutaways. The neck was a single piece of mahogany with additional wings glued on to create the headstock. It was glued into the center block like a Les Paul's. A rosewood fingerboard was glued to the neck over the truss rod slot. The neck joined the body at the 19th fret, giving a lot of access to the upper frets of the 22-fret fingerboard. By way of comparison, the neck on an ES-175 joins the body at the 14th fret, much like a steel string dreadnought guitar. The scale length was the common Gibson 24 3/4 inches. There were dots of pearl plastic position markers inlaid in the fingerboard, and the nut was made from hard plastic. There were Kluson Deluxe tuners with the closed metal backs and plastic tulip-shaped buttons. The Gibson logo was inlaid in pearl in the headstock, and it had a crowned inlay. 2 of the new PAF sticker humbucking pickups came with nickel covers. The bridge was the patented Gibson Tune-O-Matic ABR1 model with plated metal saddles. It had 4 clear plastic control knobs with gold bases. These knobs are now generally referred to as bell or top hat style knobs. There was a small metal pointer mounted under each knob. The control knobs were in the now familiar 2-volume, 2-tone configuration. The pickup selector was a standard 3-way, and the output jack was on the front of the guitar face. An orange-colored label could be seen glued to the back of the guitar through the treble side F-hole. After the official release at the 1958 Summer NAMM show in Chicago, Gibson began plans for offering additional models based on the 335 shape: the 345, 355, and the 330. The 345 and 355 were slated to have upscale fingerboard inlays and hardware, explaining why the 335 had to keep the dots for now. Late in the 58 model year, binding was also added to the 335 to give the fingerboard a little bit more finished look. The 330 was a fully hollow guitar in the same shape as the 335, but without the center block. The earliest guitars had a thinner 3-ply laminate. This was changed to a 4-ply laminate late in 58. During this time, the neck angle was also increased slightly. The early tops often exhibited a crack near the output jack, and this is likely why Gibson switched to the 4-ply. Very early 58s have slightly more pointed cutaways, which by the fall of the year had become rounded to what is now commonly referred to as the Mickey Mouse ears, so very desirable among collectors. In 1959, Gibson made a few other changes, which added together make this the most desirable model year. The fret size was increased slightly, and the neck profile was also increased, like what we see on the Les Pauls. However, Kluson changed the plastic it used in the Tulip tuners in 59 for the worse, often leading to problems as they age. The guitars were officially the ES-335 TD for Sunburst, ES-335 TDN for Natural, T for Thin Line, D for Double Pickup, and N for Natural. By the end of 1958, Gibson had moved forward with the flagship 355. They described it as Gibson's beautifully cherry red ES-355T, the ultimate in a double cutaway, thin line model jazz guitar. The 355 had an ebony fingerboard with pearl block inlays. It shipped with a Bigsby vibrato, and all the hardware was gold-plated. Rounding out its upscale appointments, it had a faux tortoiseshell pickguard and had multi-ply binding. And rather than the crown inlay, the headstock was graced with the split diamond. The cherry finish was created by staining the wood red and then adding successive clear coat layers over the top. The earliest guitars are more prone to fading than the later ones. The stereo 345 was brought out in the early summer months of 1959. Gibson ran a number of events dubbed the Sounds of the Future to promote the 345. The Gibson Gazette trumpeted the first true stereophonic sound for the guitar. Though Gibson crowed about their stereo innovation, Gretsch had actually filed a patent for a stereo guitar back in 1956, and Rickenbacker had launched its Ricka sound system in 58. But stereo was a new technology at the time, and many companies were trying to associate themselves with it. The Gibson system had a single stereo output jack. A Y cable was supplied with the 345 to split the output to 2 mono jacks, which could be then attached to either 2 separate amp channels or to 2 separate amplifiers. Around this time, Gibson also released stereo amplifiers to take full advantage of the 345's stereo capabilities. Also on the 345, we see the first Veritone circuit. The new Veritone was a switchable tone control with each of the positions having a different capacitor on the switch. But since there was also a separate variable tone control in the form of the tone knob, most players left the Veritone in position 1 and dialed the tone knob for the sound they wanted. Immediately recognizable are the 345's parallelogram fingerboard inlays that we know from other guitars of that era. There was triple top and body binding and gold-plated hardware similar to that of the 355. The price list in 59 listed the 3 semi-solid models with the ES-335 TD Cherry at $550, the ES-345 TD Natural for $365, and the ES-335 TD Sunburst for $279.50. Unlike the semi-solid guitars, the 330 was fully hollow. Gibson said that they expected the 330 to replace the older hollow-body thin-line models, which might explain why they released the 330 in both single and 2 pickup versions. Another difference was that the neck on the 330 was fitted further into the body, joining at the 17th fret instead of the 19th fret. The 330 had a trapeze tailpiece, and it was fitted with either 1 or 2 P90 style pickups, with 2 or 4 control knobs depending. The 330s were built in both Natural for $265 or Sunburst for $250. The The single pickup model was only offered in Sunburst and listed for $210. By the time 1960 rolled around, Gibson had success on their hands. The 335 sold about 500 units, and the more expensive 345 and 355 each sold about 300 units. Though they'd hoped the guitars would be embraced by jazzers, in fact, the folks that were playing blues and rock were the ones taking up the semi-solid guitars. B.B. King had played Gibsons in the 1940s, Fenders and Gibsons in the 50s, and by the 60s he'd settled into playing a 335 with a Bigsby tailpiece and a custom-ordered stereo wiring and baritone switch. That Sunburst guitar is the one he played on the hugely influential Live at the Regal album in November of 1964. He said it was like somebody knew what kind of guitar he'd always wanted. By 1967, King had moved to the upscale 355, still with the Bigsby stereo wiring and baritone. The high-end model really suited King, who was by then blues royalty. Other famous bluesmen settled on the 335 family guitars as well. Freddie King had played a Les Paul Gold Top in the 50s, but by the early 60s he too was playing a 345 and then later a 355. Freddie King's choice of a cherry red 355 would send Eric Clapton clamoring to get one of his own as soon as he had the means and the opportunity. Around 1960, Chuck Berry moved from a single-cut hollow-body ES-350 to a 335. One of the first country jazz players, Hank Garland, the man who helped develop the Birdland guitar, moved to playing a 345 for lots of his session work, including Patsy Cline's I Fall to Pieces, recorded late in 1960. In 1960, Gibson added a second ring to the base of the tuners, what would become now known as double ring tuners. The pickguard was shortened and it now ended in line with the bridge pickup. Most of these changes were completed by the end of '61. In 1962, Ritchie Blackmore bought a cherry-finished 335 with a Bigsby at Jim Marshall's shop in London. Gibson had only become available in Britain in 1960 following a 10-year government ban on the import of instruments from the U.S. Blackmore used the 335 on sessions around London and on the first two Deep Purple records before moving on to the Strat on the third album in '69. Even after moving to the Strat, Blackmore would still use the 335 occasionally live and in the studio. In 1962, Gibson famously changed the fretboard markers on the 335 and 330 guitars from dots to small block markers. The patent applied for stickers on the pickups were finally changed to a patent number sticker, a transition that took until '64 to complete. So guitars built across the time from '62 to '64 might have either type of label or even one of each. I reached out to TrueFire to be my sponsor because I've used them for years. I'm currently having fun going through Jim Capolongo's Sonic Tele course. With over 2 million users worldwide, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced level player, TrueFire has lessons to enhance and inspire your playing. Get 35% off courses using the promo code 5watt35, or like I do, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, you'll like them too. Sign up using the link in the description to support 5 Watt World and get some great lessons at the same time. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this video. 1963 found Elvin Bishop teaming up with Paul Butterfield to form the Butterfield Blues Band, and soon after, Michael Bloomfield would join as well. Bishop had traded his Telecaster for a Cherry 345, which suited his tone much better. And with Bloomfield playing his P90 Les Paul on the early records, they were a two Gibson frontline. Bishop went through a number of 345s, often having them stolen while they were traveling out on the road, before being able to hold on to his famous 59, nicknamed Red Dog. He really liked the Veritone switch, but like many players, he'd have the stereo wiring switched over to mono. He used the Veritone to thin out his tone to help it cut through. Tony Hicks of the Hollies also used a 345, using the Veritone switch to get an almost single-coil sound. Then he'd wind it back up to the fuller tone to overdrive his Vox AC30s. He used the guitar on many of the Hollies' early hits. Keith Richards would also play a string of ES guitars, a 330 in '67, a walnut-finished 335 in '69, and later both a white 345 and a black 355. By 1965, 12-string electric guitars had started to appear in a number of hits, and Gibson responded with the ES-335-12. Unfortunately, the 335-12 used the standard 6-string neck and a standard bridge with double-notch saddles. These features made the guitars very difficult to play, so the results were good, for about a half a song. And late in the 60s, Gibson produced a Trini Lopez model, which was effectively a Cherry 335 with diamond sound holes and a non-reversed Firebird headstock. This is probably most notable now because Dave Grohl embraced this style for his own semi-solid guitars with the Foo Fighters. By 66, a couple of things had changed. The metal parts went from being nickel-plated to chrome-plated. But most substantially, the neck width at the nut changed from 1 11/16 to 1 9/16. Though this might not sound like much, it made a big difference in feel, and it stayed that way into the late 70s. According to Tony Bacon's excellent The 335 Guitar Book, this happened because of a fluke moment when the head of production, Merle Lemon, was asked what he thought of the neck on one of their student guitars. Lemon said he thought it was great. So all the guitars in the Gibson line were changed to 1 9/16. They also decreased the neck angle slightly from 17 to 14 degrees, saying that it improved string tension. Around 67, the ES-330 neck was shifted out further from the body to match that of the 335, joining at the 19th fret. Also around this time, two other colors became available on the ES guitars, Pelham Blue and Sparkling Burgundy. In 68, Walnut, a dark brown finish, was offered and ran in the 70s as well. In 67, Alvin Lee formed 10 years after, playing a dot neck 335 that he bought for £45 in his hometown of Nottingham, England. In a 1968 interview, he guessed that the guitar was about 10 years old. The guitar started collecting stickers, including the famous peace sign, before they made their appearance at Woodstock. Semi-solid guitars were also favored on the west coast of the U.S. early on. Bob Weir played a Cherry 345 along with a 335 before switching to an SG around 72. Jorma Kaukonen and Jefferson Airplane played a Cherry 345 on the band's early records. And finally, we come around to the reason most people lust after a cherry red block neck 335. Eric Clapton bought his second 335, the one that we all point to, in November of 68, a 64 red 335, just a couple of weeks before Cream's final two shows at London's Royal Albert Hall. Guitarist Jerry Donahue was working at the counter at Selmer's Music Store in Charing Cross Road. Donahue remembered, "Was one of my main highlights of working at Selmer's. You can imagine my amazement and joy later as I sat watching Cream come out on the Albert Hall, Eric with the 335 strapped on. He played that guitar for the entire evening. I was filled with pride." 40 years later, Clapton's 335 with original case would sell at an auction for $850,000 to benefit his Crossroads Rehabilitation Center. Clapton had played the 335 for those final days in Cream, then in Blind Faith. He's used the 335 in his bluesiest moments since, on his From the Cradle record and then the following tour in 94 and 95. Eric Johnson owns a 64 Cherry Red 335 that, per his own comments, was inspired by Clapton's influence. Famously, Eric recorded the majority of his Grammy-winning Cliffs of Dover with that 335. In 69, Gibson merged and became part of Norland Industries. There's been much written about the interest in profit over quality at Gibson during the Norland years. The sound holes on the 335 had been slightly enlarged the year before, and along with the volute added on the necks were changed out from a one-piece to a three-piece neck. The tenon on the neck was made shorter. By 70, the two internal mahogany end blocks were dropped, and the maple center block ran the length of the entire body. Collectors consider all of these changes to be indicators of the decline in quality during that time. The 330 was dropped from the catalog in 71, but Gibson's continued to build semi-solid guitars throughout the 70s, simplifying the color offerings to Sunburst, Cherry, and Walnut. Though all Larry Carlton really wanted to do was be able to play jazz gigs like his heroes Wes Montgomery, he found himself settling into a day job playing studio sessions. His tools included a Les Paul, a Telecaster, and a Gibson 175. But he wanted something more versatile. Carlton said, "I wanted a guitar that kind of felt like a jazz box, but didn't have the sound like a jazz box, and the 335 seemed to be an obvious choice." Telling the story of buying his 69 right off the rack, he said simply, "I chose this one because it sounded the best to me." Playing with the Crusaders cemented Carlton's 335 in the West Coast sound of the time. Across this time, he had become a first-call session player, and he estimates that he played 500 sessions a year between 1970 and 1976. There's a saying that luck is when preparation meets opportunity, and that certainly is true of Carlton's work with Steely Dan. 1976 found them in the studio working on The Royal Scam, material perfect for Carlton's mix of jazz complexity and rock emotion. Carlton continues to tour to this day, and unlike many, still plays his original 335 out on the road, saying that people expect to see it. Becker and Fagan seemed to really embrace the sound of a 335, as many of their other favorite soloists used them. Jay Graydon and Steve Kahn both played Gibson semi-solid guitars. I read in an interview with Kahn that he became so used to his 335 they had a Strat-style guitar built with the same string spacing to make switching more seamless. In 1970, at just 17 years old, Alex Lifeson had a chance to buy a '68 335. He said, "I always loved the shape of the 335, curvy and round, but slim as well. Plus, it was really nicely balanced. It had a slightly nasal tone, but wonderful sustain." Lifeson played it almost exclusively from 70 to 76 when he got his famous 355. The white 355 was ordered from Gibson late in 1975. He took delivery of the guitar in the spring of 76, and though heavier than his 335, it became his main guitar until 82. He used it on all the albums across that time: Hemispheres, Permanent Waves, and Moving Pictures. Around 76, Gibson made a change to the Tune-o-matic bridge. It was made a little bit longer. Dubbed the Nashville Bridge, it allows a little bit more intonation adjustment. And 78 saw the introduction of a tailpiece with fine tuners on it, and it was added to the high-end 355. In the early 80s, brass hardware thought to increase sustain was all the rage, and Gibson put out a guitar, the ES-347, that had all the bells and whistles of the era. Brass hardware, coil tap switching, and the bridge was mounted in beefy brass studs. The model lasted in the catalog until 1990. On the other end of things, they launched the ES-335 Pro, the first dot marker 335 since moving to the small block inlays in '62. By 1980, it had come time to build a 335 reissue with the features of the classic guitars that would bring players back to Gibson. They had original drawings and they had some vintage examples, and so they applied the same approach to the 335. They went back to a one-piece mahogany neck that measured 1 11/16 at the nut and a 17-inch degree angle at the headstock. They corrected both the rim shape and the top arch. They made the horns rounder again, bringing back the Mickey Mouse ears. Tim Shaw had begun to reproduce a PAF-style pickup, and these became the pickups in the reissue. They also went back to the ABR-1 bridge. They used Grover tuners because Klusons weren't being made that would work at the time. They called it done. These came out in '81 as the ES-335 Dot. The reissue Dot guitars were listed for $995 at a time when original 59 Dots could still be bought for around $2,500. B.B. King had become a Gibson endorser in 1969. 1980 found Gibson working with King on a signature guitar. This new guitar would be a 355, but without the F-holes to further help cut the possibility of feedback. The production versions came out in the spring of '81. The B.B. King Standard and the B.B. King Custom. They still had the classic semi-solid construction, laminated maple top and back, and a period-typical three-piece maple neck. In 1986, Gibson introduced the 335 Studio, which shared many traits with the B.B. King Standard, which included not having F-holes in the top, had dot markers on an unbound fingerboard, chrome metalwork, and it was also offered in black or cherry. Later in the 70s, in the rage of active electronics, Gibson built the ES Artist guitars. Almost custom shop spec before there was a custom shop, ebony fingerboard, flame top, no F-holes, and active electronics designed by synthesizer designer Bob Moog. The early 90s found Mike McGuire working in the custom shop after having run Valley Arts guitars. He'd had years of inputs from working with artists, and he started thinking about a different semi-solid guitar. This would end up being the 336. First on the list was to build a smaller version of a 335. At 16 inches, the 335 is a pretty big guitar. He also wanted to change the way the guitar is constructed to deal with some of the inconsistencies. The back, sides, and block on a 336 were routed out of a single piece of mahogany, and this, along with a carved solid maple top, some say shifted the tone a step towards a Les Paul. The earliest ones had the snakehead headstocks we recognize from the early custom shop instruments. They were 14 inches instead of 16, and a lot of people really liked the new size. By 1998, they were also producing a 346. In 2012, a factory version of a 336 style construction was released as the Midtown, first with P90 pickups and later with humbuckers. Meanwhile, the 336 guitars continue to be produced in the custom shop in both plain and figure top versions, adding body binding to the back looking more and more like small 335s, albeit with very different construction. The next step in the smaller semi-solid direction was the ES-339 in 2007 from Gibson Memphis. Unlike the 336 with its solid back and sides, this one really is a scaled down 335, and it sounds much more like a 335 than most 336s. Following the 339, they released the 359, which was a scaled down 355, and in 2012, a 390, which is a fully hollow scaled down 330 style guitar. In 2015, they did a short run of 349s with appointments from the old 345 guitars, but in this new 14-inch body size of the 339. Gibson Memphis went on to produce a number of notable signature guitars, mainly modified production models that would be customized to meet their specs. The first was a signature ES-335 made for Andy Summers in 2001, modeled on his favorite 1960s faded cherry 335 that he bought when he was first touring with the Police. The Larry Carlton signature guitar was introduced in 2002. A short run of 50 guitars were built, its exact replicas, in the custom shop in 2004. According to Carlton, Gibson got it all right, including the uniquely faded Sunburst, which Gibson now refers to as a Carlton Burst. The one that everybody was waiting for was an Eric Clapton signature, and in 2005, they got it. Clapton had auctioned his 335 in 2004, and it was bought by Guitar Center. They collaborated with Clapton in the custom shop in Nashville to build a run of 250 replicas, and they all worked together to make the limited run a reality. And so the Eric Clapton Crossroads 335 was born. And then a parade of artists' signatures were done. Tom DeLonge in a brown finish in 2003, Alvin Lee in 2005, Roy Orbison's black 335s in 2006, Alex Lifeson's white 355 in 2007, a couple of different Dave Grohl models in 2007 and 2014, Lee Rittenauer in 2008, Joe Bonamassa's Sunburst 335 in 2012, Chris Cornell's 335 with Lawler Filtertron-style pickups in 2013, Rich Robinson in 2014 based on his 63-style Cherry 335, and a Warren Haynes based on his 61 faded cherry red guitar. The most recent 335 was the very limited run for Nashville ace J.D. Simo. He'd cut his teeth in Don Kelly's band, mostly on a Telecaster, but he acquired a 62 335 from a friend, which has become a mainstay for him ever since. Gibson's only done one collector's choice guitar that was not a Les Paul, and it was for J.D. Simo's 335. For many years, my 335 style guitar was a fully hollow 339 sized ES-390. But last year I sold that guitar with many others and replaced them with a pair of Collings guitars, including one of their I-30s, their version of a 330 fully hollow thin-line guitar. Like the 390 did, the I-30 lives through guitar purges because it fills a tonal notch for me as my jazziest guitar, but it also gives me everything from a Gretsch-like twang to a Beatlesy Epiphone Casino vibe. I joke that I ended up buying the Tim Lurch Adam Levy signature model, as both of those guys have this guitar in this exact same color. And the flame maple on this thing is intoxicating. I imagine for all my reasons and others, the 335 remains one of the absolutely classic guitars, and one folks regularly put on their list of dream guitars. You guys got it right way back at the beginning of the channel. A Tele, a Strat, a Les Paul, and a 335 for everything else. I need to thank my good friend David Barber for writing and performing the music in the intro and the outro on his recently acquired ES-335. I'd also like to thank the guys at Carter Vintage Guitars in Nashville for sharing the pics from their archives of guitars I could only have found at Carter Vintage. This video would not have been possible without Tony Bacon's excellent The Gibson 335 Guitar Book. There's a link to the book in the description. If I missed something, or if you have your own 335 story to tell, please share it in the comments for everyone to enjoy. If you enjoyed this short history of the Gibson 335, hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. If you're interested in starting your own YouTube channel, check out my course, YouTube Mastery for Musicians. I outline all the parts of starting and running a channel there. It's the head start I wish I had. I want to thank everyone that stopped by the online store and grabbed some merch or a 5-watt World Barber Electronics Collaboration overdrive pedal. You keep the channel going. And in particular, I need to thank the friends of 5-watt on Patreon. It's the guitar community I've always wanted. You're all 5-watt World, I just make the videos. Thanks for hanging in with me until the end. Until next time, I'm Keith Williams. Thanks for being a part of the 5-watt World.